Good afternoon and welcome to our book talk with author Uri Kaufman with his what I'll call brilliant book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You don't want to say that about a war, but I collect books on the Yom Kippur War, and this was an outstanding read. It's called 18 Days in October, and I highly recommend it. Before I do the formal introduction, a little bit about I'll try to do it in like to 1 minute. Interest in the Yom Kippur War. My husband was a student at the Weizmann Institute of Science in 1973, and he liked to go to services, even though the conservative ones in the Israeli city of Rehovot, where Weizmann was located, was in a basement underneath the movie theater with folding chairs, not very comfortable. And of course, all in Hebrew. And I sort of to be honest, I sat at home with a prayer book at my side, but wasn't comfortable going to synagogue the way it was. I was around a little bit after 1 o'clock when my husband burst into our apartment saying, "I think a war is going on." From the basement where the mostly male attendees were sitting, there was a little sliver of light at the top of the ceiling where you could see Herzl Street. And normally on Yom Kippur in Israel, there were no cars moving unless it was a medical emergency. But that afternoon, cars were speeding up and down, sometimes on two wheels, careening around the corners, because of course the war had started. He wasn't really sure that there was a war. So he said, "Let's turn on the radio." And I said, "It's Yom Kippur." There was going to be no radio on Israeli broadcasts. So he turned on BBC, and indeed they announced a war had begun. When we turned on the Israeli radio station that we used to listen to, there were no speakers, but only martial military music. And then the sound, which I can still remember to this day, of code words in Hebrew, which announced that your unit was going to be called up and you should go and meet it at a certain point, which was everyone knew about who was serving in the reserves or the military itself. In any event, this is of great interest to me. And as I said, this is a must-read book, something very special for your synagogue library, a day school, or your own personal library. This event is sponsored by the Jewish Book Council, Congregation B'nai Shalom, and the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center in partnership with Diablo Valley Hadassah. And now, our author. Uri Kaufman is a graduate of New York University School of Law and an award-winning real estate developer specializing in restoring historic buildings. We can probably ask him which ones in the Q&A. He's worked on this book for over 20 years, visiting the battlefields, speaking to participants, and reviewing literally thousands of pages of material. And now it is our great pleasure to introduce Uri Kaufman. Thank you, Uri.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. It is really wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. This is actually something of a dream for me. I wanted to major in history back in college, but my Jewish mother sat me down and said, "Uri, I know you. You're never going to get a job with any of the history companies." So I abandoned that. Instead, I majored in Babylonian Talmud. We thought of ourselves as sort of like an elite group like the Navy SEALs. There were very few of us, and most of us dropped out. But anyway, it's good to be back, and it's great to be talking to you all, and thank you for taking the time. 3 weeks from this Friday, it will be October the 6th. 50 years ago, on October the 6th, 1973, Golda Meir sat in her office, dazed, chain-smoking, and trying to process what she had just been told. Everything that had been told to her up to that point was wrong. Egypt and Syria were about to attack the state of Israel. There were practically no Israeli soldiers in place to stop them. and it would take about 48 hours to mobilize the army. A disaster was unfolding before her eyes. But our story actually starts 6 years before that in 1967. We all know the story. The Arabs massed at the border. Then, in a stunning turn of events, Israel won in just 6 days. The war began on a Monday morning. It ended on a Saturday morning. The Shabbat before the war, people were praying that the Jewish state would survive. The Shabbat after, one New York rabbi said, I was out on vacation this past week. Did anything happen while I was gone? Well, something did happen. And what happened was the Jews controlled an undivided Jerusalem for the first time since the year 63 BCE, the first time in 2,030 years. The state of Israel was now 4 times larger than it had been just a week before. Now, every now and again, things happen in the history of the Jewish people that if you're the kind of person who likes to believe in a higher order, at least you have what to hang your hat on. The secular year of 1948 corresponds to the Jewish year 5708. So the 5708th verse or pasuk in the Torah reads, "And the Lord shall bring you to the land that your fathers inherited, and you shall inherit it, and the Lord shall make it better for you and make you more numerous than your fathers." And what about the 5727th verse, which corresponds to the Jewish year of 5727 and the secular year 1967? So that pasuk reads, "And the Lord shall do to them as he did to Sichon and Og, the Canaanite kings, that he utterly destroyed them." Well, it's a cute little fact. Some saw divine inspiration in what had taken place, but the Israeli government fortunately treated it with a much more level head. After the war, Israel had a unity government. The prime minister was Levi Eshkol from the Labor Party, but it also included the Likud's Menachem Begin. It represented 108 out of 120 seats in the Knesset, an all-time record, which is almost certain never to be surpassed. That government, which again represented pretty much everyone in society, voted unanimously to trade the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights for peace treaties. The government was a little more coy with respect to Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. The only thing they said definitively was they were never going to give up Jerusalem. The Arabs infamously responded with the 3 no's: no recognition, no negotiations, and most importantly, no peace. So that was the state of affairs as long as Nasser lived. Nasser was the president of Egypt during the 67 war. He passed away in September of 1970. He was replaced by his vice president, Anwar Sadat. Nobody expected Anwar Sadat to be the president. Sadat only named him after a failed coup, and that was only because Sadat was totally loyal to him. He was the only person in Egypt that he could appoint vice president without having to hire a food taster. Everyone held Sadat in total contempt. Elliot Richardson, you might remember him of Watergate fame. He was the one sent by America to represent the United States at Nasser's funeral. He came back home and said Sadat wouldn't last 6 weeks. Kissinger is said to have called Sadat a buffoon. But Sadat soon showed he was no buffoon at all. The opposite. He was much more clever than Nasser. He was the first Arab leader to use the P word. He said he would live in peace with Israel. This was a bombshell. The very first Arab leader to say he'd live in peace with Israel. The trouble was there was a catch. The catch was his terms. Under his terms, Israel had to withdraw from everywhere. The whole Sinai Peninsula, the whole Golan Heights. Even if Syria did not give it a peace treaty, all of Judea, Samaria, East Jerusalem, and even the Kotel. And even that wasn't enough. We're not done yet. He said Israel also had to solve the Palestinian refugee problem. And then, just to be absolutely sure that that would never happen, Sadat met with Palestinian leaders and he said to them, do not make peace on any terms. So why was he doing this? It's obvious that he was engaging in what I call yes-manship, the fine art of appearing to be saying yes, even though you really aren't, so that the other side gets blamed when the whole thing blows up. Well, the whole thing did blow up. Obviously, Israel could never agree to terms like that. He might as well have conditioned his terms on pigs flying. But then Moshe Dayan came up with a very, very creative proposal. It became known as the interim agreement. Under this, Israel would agree to withdraw 30 miles east from the Suez Canal to the Mitla and Gidi passes. and let Egypt reopen the Suez Canal. In return, Egypt had to withdraw its army 30 miles to the west. Most importantly, Egypt had to withdraw its surface-to-air missiles, which was the only defense it had against the Israeli Air Force. So then, in any future war, the Israeli Air Force would dominate the battlefield. In short, the core bargain was Israel would let Egypt reopen the Suez Canal if in return, Egypt gave up any realistic military option that it might have. Sadat turned this down flat. The most he ever offered was that if Israel withdrew from all of Sinai and all of the Golan Heights, but Egypt having the right to bring its army back into the Sinai Peninsula, then he would give Israel, well, the rough equivalent of a ceasefire agreement. To this, Henry Kissinger said, and I'm quoting, "To ask Israel to withdraw from all occupied territories without offering what is normal between most states, namely peace, would have been an absurdity." Well, that's where matters stood, and that's where the battle lines were drawn. The Arabs wanted to get the land back without giving a peace treaty. Israel was only willing to give up the land if it got a peace treaty. So now Sadat sat down to plan a war. Most importantly, he sat down with his main general, his chief of staff, probably the best general the Israelis have ever faced. It was a man named Saad Shazli. Now, the dominant fact on all Middle East battlefields, then as now, is the Israeli Air Force. The fighter jet is the wonder weapon that allows a tiny nation that then only had about 3 million people to hold off Arab nations that combined had populations of over 80 million. The Egyptians only had one answer to the Israeli Air Force, and that was the surface-to-air missiles, or the SAMs. The SAMs devastated the American Air Force in Vietnam. I'm sure many of you remember. It was a Soviet SAM that actually shot down John McCain's plane. The trouble with the SAMs was its range was actually very, very limited. If you position SAMs west of the Suez Canal, the most they could reach was about 6 miles east of the Suez Canal. The Syrians could do a little bit better. If they pushed their SAMs right up to the ceasefire line, they could cover the whole Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is only about 27 miles wide at its widest. But nevertheless, in war, the main thing is making sure the main thing stays the main thing. For Egypt, the main thing was dealing with the Israeli Air Force. So General Shazli, the Egyptian general, said that Egypt should just advance 6 miles east of the canal. That's all. The range within which the SAMs could protect them, and then wage a war of attrition from there. Israel couldn't stay on a war footing for long. It depended on reservists. Once those reservists were called up, Israeli factories went dark. Thus, said General Saad Shazli, if Egypt could just survive and fight a war of attrition, Israel would have to sue for terms for peace. It was a very, very risky plan, mostly because military offensives are usually designed to fight until they reach some easy-to-defend spot, like a river, a ridge line, something like that. Shazli's plan was advance and just stop cold in the desert. It was not a great plan, but it was still the best plan that Egypt had. The hardest part for Egypt was going to be the early stages, because right when you cross the water, it was going to be infantry against Israeli tanks. It was going to be men trying to hold out against a much larger force. So the only way to do that was with the element of surprise. Now, sometime in 1969, a well-dressed man entered the Israeli embassy in London, and he offered to trade secrets in return for money, a lot of money. The man's name we now know was Ashraf Marwan. He was Nasser's son-in-law, married to his favorite daughter, his daughter Mona. Sadat wanted to maintain ties with the Nasser family for political reasons, so he made Ashraf Marwan one of his aides. Then, in 1971, Marwan supported Sadat in a failed coup. Sadat rewarded him by naming him his chief of staff. In that position, he saw literally everything that came across Sadat's desk. According to published reports, the Israelis paid Ashraf Marwan the staggering sum of $20 million. This is in 2018 dollars. If you want to put that in a proper context, the spy, at least that we know of, who is thought to have received the most money ever was Aldrich Ames, a former CIA agent. He is sitting in jail, serving life without parole, and he only received $4 million. One of the most important things that Marwan told the Israelis was something that took on a life of its own. It became known in Israel as the conceptia, or just the concept. The concept said that Syria would never go to war without Egypt. That actually turned out to be right. It's true to this day. And that Egypt would not go to war until it had advanced Soviet fighter jets that could contend with the Israeli Air Force. Because those planes, MiG-25s and MiG-23s, were not scheduled for delivery until late 1974, and it takes about a year or two to train pilots, the Israelis figured they had some breathing room. The Egyptians, unfortunately, had some other ideas. They were literally at their end of their rope, particularly Sadat. In 1972, a group of writers put out an open letter demanding that Sadat take action. In June of 1972, which was, of course, the 5th anniversary of the 67 war, a group of officers holed themselves up in a Cairo mosque and demanded action as well. Sadat realized there was no way he was going to last unless he took action quickly. The Egyptians mobilized and demobilized 23 times before October 1973. It happened on 2 occasions, one in December of 1972 and one in May of 1973, that notwithstanding the concept, Marwan even warned of an attack. But in both cases, the Israelis never mobilized. So the question is, why didn't they mobilize? And the answer is because the Israelis had yet another important intelligence gathering method. It was a group of listening devices deep inside Cairo, and it was known as the extraordinary measures. The problem with the extraordinary measures was that they ran on a battery that was driven very, very hard. And with the technology of the day, the battery would drain out quickly. And then once it drained, you'd have to send somebody deep into Egypt to replace it. Because of that, the extraordinary measures were typically turned off. They were only turned on under circumstances that were, well, frankly, extraordinary. In December and in May, December 1972, May 1973, the Israelis turned on the extraordinary measures, we now know, and they revealed that Egypt was not planning to attack, it was only planning a drill. So in each case, the extraordinary measures were proven correct. They were even better than Ashraf Marwan. They became known internally within Israel as the national insurance policy. Now, the head of Israel's military intelligence arm, which is known by its Hebrew acronym of Amen, the head of it was a man by the name of Eli Zeira. Eli Zeira, who, by the way, is still alive, he's well into his 90s. He was not the sort of man that suffered from low self-esteem. In fact, he was never blessed with a moment of self-doubt at all. Because of the concept, and because Egypt did not attack in December and May, Zeira was absolutely convinced there was no way the Egyptians would ever go to war. Thus, when the Egyptians and the Syrians mobilized again in late September and early October of 1973, he ordered that the extraordinary measures not even be turned on. He was that sure war would not break out. The real problem was he then lied to his superiors. His superiors were Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, Chief of Staff of the Army, General David Elazar, and Golda Meir. He told them he had turned on the extraordinary measures and that they revealed that nothing was happening when in reality he had not turned them on. When the superiors heard that the extraordinary measures said nothing was going to happen, well, they figured nothing was going to happen. As this was playing out, 2 enormous armies were mobilizing along Israel's border. Then, on October the 4th, Ashraf Marwan finally reached out. And a dramatic meeting in London on the evening of October the 5th, he told the head of the Mossad, a man named Tzvi Zamir, who's also still alive, he's about 100 years old, he told them that an attack was going to come the next day. Marwan said the attack would come before dark. And on that day, October the 6th, the sun set at about 20 after 5 in the afternoon. But of course, 2 o'clock in the afternoon is also before dark. Nevertheless, word went up down the line in Israel that the attack would come at around 6 o'clock. And that is where we return to Golda, chain smoking in her office. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she was wrapping up a meeting with her cabinet, and then the sirens went off. She turned to her stenographer and she asked, "What's that?" And the stenographer replied, "It looks like the war has begun." Golda had a habit of reverting to her native tongue, which was Yiddish, in times of stress, and she said, "Na das felt mir nice." This is just what my life was missing. I can remember my grandmother saying the same thing. Now, Golda's chief of staff was a man named David Elazar. He was known universally by his nickname Dado. Dado first rose to prominence in the 1948 war when he was a 23-year-old major. He commanded a force of 210 men in a battle in southwest Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, defending a monastery called San Simon. It was a brutal battle. By the end of the day, 85 of his men were dead and 110 were wounded. So he only had 15 men left who were unharmed. They were almost out of ammunition. When you're down to your last 15 men and your last few bullets, it means the battle is lost. And Eleazar was about to ask for authority to withdraw, but then he remembered something that he was told by his commander, Beni Marshak. Beni Marshak said, when it rains on you, the enemy is also getting wet. In other words, when it rains on you and you're hungry and you're tired, it's just as hard for the guy on the other side. The side that holds on just 1 minute longer is the side that wins. So many of the great battles of history were decided because one side held on just 1 minute longer. Well, on that day, Dado Eleazar held out just a little longer, and then his officers reported that the Arabs were retreating and the battle was won. It's one of the most important victories of the 48 War. He won by holding out 1 minute longer. Well, back in 1973, Dado, Moshe Dayan, and Golda were faced with some very, very difficult decisions. What do you do in a scenario of total surprise? The Israelis thought that such a scenario was impossible, so they never even planned for it. So all the decisions had to be made on the fly, which is not the way you want to do it. The war began very, very badly for Israel. They lost between 150 and 170 tanks along the canal right on the first day. That was 10% of Israel's entire arsenal. The situation with fighter jets was almost as bad. And at that burn rate, the state of Israel was going to run out of planes and tanks in the space of maybe 2 weeks. Moshe Dayan, who up to that point was literally the very embodiment of the fighting spirit of Israel, said that the third temple is at risk. From that moment forward, Golda was faced with a series of absolutely brutal decisions, each more difficult than the other. The first question was what to do with the reserve division. The choices were hold it back and use it to defend Jerusalem from a potential attack by Jordan, or send it up north to fight the Syrians. The generals were split right down the middle. Amman said Jordan would never open up a third front, but of course Amman had just screwed up. They got the whole thing wrong with respect to Egypt and Syria. Golda made the decision, she rolled the dice, and she sent the division north. For 2 nerve-shattering weeks, Jerusalem was naked to attack, but the Jordanians never attacked. And the division that Golda sent north pushed the Syrians back to the ceasefire line. The next decision related to the Egyptians. Dayan advised pulling back to the easy-to-defend Mitla and Gidi passes. That would allow the equipment losses to ease, but it would also make it impossible to cross the canal and win the war. Golda listened to Dado, and she overruled Dayan. She ordered the army to dig in and fight. Once again, she turned out to be correct. The equipment losses eased, and the army held its ground close enough to the canal to later cross it and, as it turned out, win the war. The next decision came just a couple days later. Word got back that the Soviets were about to propose a ceasefire in the UN. Golda knew that Israel would need something to trade. So the choices were to either hunker down and prepare for a war of attrition or attack Syria to try to win some bargaining chips. So once again, the generals were split right down the middle. Israel could not afford to lose any tanks in that scenario. But nevertheless, Golda once again decided to roll the dice. She ordered an attack, and the army succeeded. It conquered a big bulge inside Syria. The outskirts of Damascus were under artillery range. So now, at least with respect to Syria, Israel had some bargaining chips. The problem was what to do with Egypt. So with respect to Egypt, Israel agreed to the ceasefire. This is on October the 12th. They agreed to the ceasefire for a really good reason. They had absolutely no choice. They were running out of weapons. Kissinger in Washington promised to resupply Israel, but then he slow-walked it. He claimed that he was facing a so-called bureaucratic runaround in Washington. And in reality, he wasn't facing any such bureaucratic runaround at all, but that's what he said. So Israel wasn't getting any weapons, and he made it clear that Israel wasn't going to get weapons unless it agreed to the ceasefire. As late as October the 12th, Israel got nothing, even though the Soviets were rushing supplies into the Arabs. But then a miracle happened, at least from Israel's perspective. Sadat foolishly turned down the ceasefire proposal. When that happened, Henry Kissinger called his aide, Brent Scowcroft, and he said, it's time to start pouring stuff in there. Suddenly, the bureaucratic runaround disappeared, and supplies came pouring through in something called Operation Nickelgrass. The C-5 Galaxy airplane was deemed a boondoggle before the Yom Kippur War. It came in handy in the war. It brought a lot of material to Israel, and no one called it a boondoggle after that. That's where it proved its worth. The question for Israel was what to do next. They had weapons, but they still had to deal with Egypt east of the canal. All the attempts to remove Egypt failed. It was obvious that the only way to push Egypt out was to cross the canal and win the war west of the canal. Trouble was the Egyptians had 2 divisions west of the canal. So how do you contend with them? As they were debating the issue, someone came in and handed a note to the head of the Mossad, Tzvika Zamir. It was a note that we now know, in fact, it was revealed in October 2020, that Israel had another super source, this one inside the Egyptian army. We don't know this individual's name, and I'm sure we never will. He was an officer in the Egyptian army. The only thing we know is that he was a pretty senior officer in the Egyptian army. And by October 2020, he had died of natural causes years before, and he had never been discovered by Egyptian counterintelligence. The Egyptian officer told the Israelis that a major offensive was about to be launched. That offensive came 2 days later on October the 14th. When it came, the Israelis were waiting for it. It was the second largest battle in the history of the world up to that point, only surpassed by the Battle of Kursk, which took place in World War II between Germany and the USSR. On October the 14th, the Egyptians came, the Israelis were waiting, and when the battle was over, Egypt lost 250 tanks, the Israelis lost only 6. So the balance was starting to shift in Israel's favor. This is when Israel went on the offensive. The Israelis only had 650 tanks along the canal. They would eventually send 400 of them across. This was a huge, huge risk. The risk was not that they would get stopped in Africa. The risk was they would cross, and then the bridges over the canal would be cut off, and all that men and all that material would be lost. Moshe Dayan told Golda that if that happened, they'd find themselves fighting on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. So they were literally playing with the future of the country itself. Now, to cross the canal, they first had to lay a bridge. Crossing any body of water is one of the hardest things to do in military affairs. Up until 1973, all combat engineers, going back to Alexander the Great, did it the same way. You brought pontoons to the river, and then combat engineers had to lay them in place under fire. Now, the problem was twofold. Very hard to lay a bridge with people shooting at you. And second of all, you end up with a really rickety bridge. Remember, a bridge is only as strong as its weakest point. So to solve that problem, the Israelis invented something groundbreaking. It was called the rolling bridge. The rolling bridge was a massive steel bridge placed on rollers that were filled with buoyant polyurethane. The problem with it was it weighed 450 tons, and it needed anywhere from 12 to 17 tanks to push it into place. Worst of all, it couldn't turn at all. It had to travel straight as a ruler, straight into place. Because of this, before the war, the Israelis paved a road that was as straight as a ruler. It was called Tir Tur, but that road had to travel through a place called the Chinese Farm. The Chinese Farm was actually neither Chinese nor a farm. It was a Japanese agricultural research center that was established in the 60s to combat world hunger. Israeli soldiers came upon it in 1967, mistook it, the Japanese lettering for Chinese, and the name just stuck. The Chinese Farm was crisscrossed with irrigation canals, which made it perfect for defense, and over 3,000 Egyptian troops were dug in there. No matter what the Israelis did, they just could not dislodge the Egyptians. And without dislodging them, they couldn't get the rolling bridge in place. So on the night of October the 16th, the Israeli General Staff made a stark decision. If the road wasn't open that night, they were going to just abandon the effort. If they had done that, of course, Israel would have lost the war. Meanwhile, Ariel Sharon had already crossed the canal on motorized rafts. He was there on the west bank of the canal with a very, very small force, and he was ordered to just sit tight. Throughout the war, Sharon never sat tight, and he was defying his orders. This time, what he did was he sent a very small force on the west bank of the canal, traveling north as he put it, to look for Egyptian artillery spotters. That was supposedly the mission. He gave them that mission because, of course, the whole thing was unauthorized. They were told to travel north along a train track where all the Egyptians could see them, which was, of course, the most dangerous way for the men to do it. They went 1 mile. They didn't see any artillery spotters, so they were told to keep going. They went another mile. No artillery spotters. They were told to keep going. They kept going until they advanced 4 miles, which meant it was beyond what any artillery spotter could ever see. And they were said, keep going north. They finally came upon a village in Egypt called Sarafayum. And then when they got there, they were told inexplicably to just open fire, shoot the place up. They started shooting like crazy. They came upon an Egyptian force that was exponentially as large as their own. But one of the men, his name was Asa Kadmoni, went up on the roof of a building by himself. He took a shoulder-fired rocket and took out an Egyptian truck, killed 30 Egyptians. Then he held off a force estimated to be 300 men all by himself for 4 hours. Israeli intelligence intercepted a message from the Egyptians reporting that there was, quote, a crazy Jew on the roof and they just couldn't kill him. One journalist later called Asa Kadmoni the greatest history in all of Israeli history. The greatest hero, excuse me. After 4 hours, a relief column finally arrived, and the men in Sarafayum, they were livid. Like, why were they ordered on this crazy mission? Why were they told to travel where everyone could see them and then start a battle against a much larger force for no apparent reason? What they didn't realize was they had won the war for Israel. Egyptian generals saw what they thought was this massive offensive on the west bank of the canal, so they withdrew their men on the east bank of the canal from the Chinese farm. They moved them further north to straighten out their lines. This is what opened up the pathway to the canal. This is what allowed them to lay down the rolling bridge. In other words, Ariel Sharon faked them out. Once they got over the rolling bridge, Israeli tanks fanned out across the Egyptian heartland. They started destroying Egyptian surface-to-air missiles, and it opened up the skies before the Israeli Air Force. Before the war, the Israelis had hoped to jam the Egyptian missiles with radar and electronic countermeasures. When this happened, General Chaim Bar-Lev told Golda the best electronic countermeasure to a missile is a tank. The tanks were chewing up the surface-to-air missiles, so now it opened up the way for the Israeli Air Force to finally do what it was supposed to do all along. Sadat saw what was happening. He pleaded with the Soviets to impose a ceasefire. The Soviets reached out to the Americans. The Americans were only too happy to oblige them. Kissinger got on a plane and he flew to Moscow on October the 20th, 1973. When he landed, he was told that the Arabs had imposed an oil embargo. Now, before he left, Kissinger was told by the heads of the largest American oil companies that during World War II, American rationing had only reduced domestic American demand for oil by 6%. An Arab oil embargo, Kissinger was told, threatened to reduce American supplies by 18%. Worse still, and this is only one example, in 1973, Gulf Oil pumped 2.5 million barrels a day. Of those 2.5 million barrels, 1.5 million came from Kuwait. If the Arabs nationalized those oil wells, the American oil companies would be practically out of business. So Kissinger was very, very motivated to get this crisis done and ended as quickly as possible. He was so motivated that within 4 hours, he committed the Israelis to a ceasefire, and he did it without demanding the most basic thing. This was the moment to demand that the Arabs lift the oil embargo. He could have called King Faisal of Saudi Arabia right from Moscow and said, look, if you want me to rescue the Egyptian army, I'll be happy to do it, but I want you to rescue American motorists. So why didn't he do that? I attempted twice to interview Dr. Kissinger. He declined. No surprise there. He doesn't know who I am. But I did interview 2 of his aides, and they both just said, hey, he just made a bad mistake. The UN passed the ceasefire on October the 22nd. The Israelis were close to surrounding the Egyptian Third Army, which was on the east bank of the canal. But if they were told to stop, they would have to fight from overextended lines deep in Egypt, and the Egyptian Third Army could still be supplied by the Egyptians. So this, for Golda, was literally the hardest decision of the war. Do you listen to Kissinger? Do you stop? Or do you keep going, defy Washington, defy the UN, defy the whole planet, and maybe even touch off World War III? Golda gave the army the authority to keep going. On October the 23rd, a day after the ceasefire was passed in the UN Security Council, and in total defiance of Washington, the Israelis surrounded the Egyptian Third Army. The Russians were absolutely outraged. They threatened to intervene directly unless the Israelis pulled back and gave up their grip on the Egyptian Third Army. The Americans responded to that by going to DEFCON 3, which was a heightened state of alertness that signaled the willingness to go to war. In Washington, the White House Chief of Staff was Alexander Haig, a future Supreme NATO commander and a future Secretary of State. He said it was a foregone conclusion that the Soviets were going to intervene. Golda still wouldn't budge. The Soviets did back down, but the threat was hardly over for Israel. Golda was called to Washington for some of the most acrimonious meetings ever held between an Israeli prime minister and an American secretary of state. Golda stayed in Washington, D.C. in the Blair House, while Egyptian Foreign Minister Ismail Fahmy stayed in the State Department. Kissinger drove back and forth. The Egyptian position was very clear. Israel had to withdraw and had to comply with UN Security Council Resolution 338. It had to release its grip on the Egyptian Third Army. The entire world had spoken on the issue. Israel could not defy the whole planet. Golda, a lioness in orthopedic shoes, dug in her heel. She said Israel was not going to withdraw under any scenario. The only deal Israel would do was a separation agreement on Israel's terms, and it would only allow a supply of the Egyptian Third Army if the Egyptians agreed to a prisoner swap. That's where the lines were drawn. This went on for a whole week, and it got very ugly. Kissinger told Golda in unusually blunt language, "You rely too much on Jewish senators." She shot back, "Well, who should I rely on?" Kissinger said that a little country like Israel can't touch off World War III. Golda said Israel didn't want to touch off World War III, but it wasn't going to go lose a war to prevent it. Golda also said it was unfair to deny Israel a victory after it was attacked. Kissinger said this was not the first time in history that something unfair was done to the Jews. Golda said the reason the Jews had a state was to make sure that unfair things didn't happen anymore. This went on, and Kissinger finally lost his patience. He said he'd had enough. If fighting breaks out, he said, Golda, Israel will stand alone. America will not resupply you. Golda said, I don't care. You march back to the State Department and you tell that Egyptian that we will not withdraw and we will not supply the Egyptian Third Army unless Egypt agrees to an exchange of POWs. Kissinger said, you're out of your mind. I am not going to do this. She said, do it anyway. Kissinger said, fine. He stormed out of the room. He went to the State Department. He called her 2 hours later and he said there had been a breakthrough. The Egyptians gave in. They agreed to negotiate directly with Israel. They agreed to the exchange of POWs. They agreed to all of Israel's terms. In other words, Golda held out 1 minute longer. And in that 1 minute, she won the Yom Kippur War. The Egyptians agreed to a separation agreement. It allowed them to keep that tiny little sliver of land that they had won east of the canal, but it required them to move their tanks and their missiles, their surface-to-air missiles, far west of the Suez Canal. In substance, it was almost identical to the interim agreement that Moshe Dayan had proposed before the war. Egypt got the Suez Canal, but it had to give up any realistic military option that it might have. Muhammad Heikel, the editor of the Egyptian newspaper Al-Ahram, was a close friend of Sadat at the time. He wrote, quote, from a military viewpoint, the disengagement agreement left Egypt in a worse position than it had been before October the 6th, in that resumption of the war of attrition was now impossible. Upon hearing the terms, the Egyptian general Mohammed Gamasi rose from his chair, walked over to a window and tried to hide his tears. But Egypt did give in. Syria eventually did the same. The Syrians got back the tiny ruined little village of Quneitra. There was not enough ground for them to even bury their dead. And they had to move their army and their surface-to-air missiles far from the battlefield. Whatever military option they had before was now gone. In short, Israel had what it always wanted. The Arabs were now faced with a stark choice: make peace with losing the 1967 lands or make peace with Israel. There were bread riots in Egypt in 1977. The economy was collapsing. Sadat tried to solve his economic problems by stealing some of Libya's oil wells, but the effort failed, and so he finally gave in. He made the dramatic trip to Jerusalem, and then he eventually signed the Camp David peace treaty. In short, he made peace with Israel, so he got back to Sinai Peninsula. Syria refused to make peace with Israel, so it never got back the Golan Heights, and it can now be said with near certainty that it never will. And this, by the way, is why there's peace in the Middle East. There is absolutely no way that Jordan, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, or Sudan would have ever signed peace treaties with Israel if Egypt hadn't gone first. Egypt had to sign the first peace treaty. Egypt would never have signed the peace treaty with Israel if it hadn't lost the Yom Kippur War. So in short, Golda Meir won a stunning victory for her country. She was faced with a series of brutal decisions. She ran the table. She got every one of them right. It's the only reason Israel won. It was a performance that places her in that special pantheon where you find the Winston Churchills and Abe Lincolns of history. But sadly, the Israeli public never really saw it that way. In every poll ranking of the prime ministers, Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin always battle it out for the top spot. Gold always comes out last. But maybe now, 50 years later, a reassessment can take place, and one that allows people to see things maybe a little more clearly and with a little more perspective, and one that allows Golda to assume her rightful place that I think is among the front rank, not just of Israeli history, but of all of Jewish history. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. That's just a little bit of what the book is about. Highly recommended, gotten great reviews from people who are very involved in both Jewish studies and also Middle East politics. Right now we have 2 questions, so there's plenty of time to still write your query with the chat function. Question number 1, please comment on the argument by David Horowitz and Connor Cruz O'Brien that Golda Meir had declined an offer, a peace offer from President Sadat to start negotiations in 1971.
It's complete nonsense, and it's very easily demonstrated that it is complete nonsense. Sadat very skillfully dangled the word peace, and that's what got people excited. But the simple fact is, and this is all on the internet for those who want to look it up, then UN envoy, a man by the name of Gunnar Yaring, his conditions were, again, that Israel had to withdraw from absolutely everywhere, and they had to solve the Palestinian refugee problem, which was impossible then as now. The Palestinians weren't going to agree to anything. So, it was the same as saying he's willing to live in peace as long as pigs are flying. And the final proof of the pudding is that in an interview to the Israeli newspaper Yediot Achronot in 1987, Sadat's widow, Jian Sadat, said, I've heard many people say over the years that Anwar was willing to live in peace before 1973. I don't know why they say this. It's not true. I quote it in the book. And Sadat's position, if you just look at Kissinger's memoir, he backs this up as well. Kissinger is very critical of Israel's leadership. He thinks they're unreasonable, they're stubborn. But on this one point, he backs Golda completely. He said the Egyptians just weren't willing to live in peace before 73, and they had to lose the war first.
Another question, why would a senior member of the Egyptian military and also Sadat's son-in-law give information to Israel? And what happened, the person asked to Sadat's son-in-law, who you and I both know what happened to him.
Right. If you want to know, there's a wonderful book written by an Israeli historian named Uri Bar Yosef. It's called The Angel, which describes the whole thing. The short answer is one thing and one thing only. They both wanted money, lots of it. The Egyptian officer was paid a lot of money. As I said, Marwan got $20 million. There is a school of thought that Marwan might have been a double agent, someone sent by Egypt to deceive the Israelis. There is still a minority view in Israel that that is the case. I do not agree with that. Neither does most of the people in the know. The simple fact is there are 2 big facts in favor of the fact that he was a true spy for Israel. One is he did warn them the night before the war. He didn't have to do that. So if he was there to deceive them, he shouldn't have warned them at all. The second is he was murdered. Someone killed him. The Israelis did not do it. They made that very clear, very believably. So the most likely candidate for who would have tossed him off the balcony of his home in London is the Egyptians. And you don't do that to one of your own people. It's a near certainty that he was a true spy on behalf of Israel, motivated by money.
Thank you. Another question. Why, and you just referred to it a little bit before, Golda Meir's reputation has suffered, especially by Israelis. What accounts for that? That she's considered, yeah.
So I asked a former Israeli member of Knesset, and he smiled and he said, you know, we Israelis, we're perfectionists. There's a lot of truth to that. Israel has this ferocious culture, public culture. It's even got a name. It's called the culture of decapitation. The Israelis sack their leaders over the smallest infractions. And I think also the 67 war, it raised a lot of eyebrows, but it also raised expectations. And the Israeli public just expected that it would always be that easy. They refused to accept the idea that perhaps mistakes could be made. Also, they were very unrealistic as far as predicting a surprise attack. It had never happened before that a nation saw a surprise attack coming and mobilized to stop it, whether it was Pearl Harbor, what happened to the Soviets in Barbarossa in 41. The Germans didn't know about Normandy until it happened. And there's many, many, many examples. We didn't know about South Korea. We didn't know that Iraq was going to invade Kuwait until they did. Mind you, recently, the Biden administration, I have to say, did a very good job warning that Russia, was about to invade Ukraine. So it shows we are getting a little bit better at this. But at that time, it was pretty much almost impossible to see a surprise attack coming. But nevertheless, the Israeli public, I think, was just unrealistic in its expectations.
Thank you. Did you see someone ask the film Golda, and what is your opinion?
I thought it was a great movie. They took some liberties with a lot of the details. Moshe Dayan did not go in a helicopter above the Golan Heights. He didn't vomit. He never would have gone up in a helicopter. He would have been shot down. He did something else. He would rub his hands together in a way that kind of creeped people out. There's other details they got wrong. I'll tell you, I gulped when they said that on day 19, they surrounded the Egyptian Third Army. Of course, the title of my book is 18 Days in October, not 19. They took some liberty there. It actually happened on the 17th day, on October the 23rd. But in the main, I have to say, it's a terrific movie. They got the main points right. It's very accurate in that respect. The quality of the acting is exceptional. Liev Schreiber, who played Kissinger, and obviously Dame Helen Mirren, nothing like a dame, probably looked at the same black and white films that I did. I thought they were just spot on with the way they portrayed Kissinger and Golda. All in all, it's a great movie. I would recommend anybody to go see it.
Next question. The Egyptians believe that they won the war. Throughout the entire country, there is a 1973 boulevard. Today's Egyptians stand tall with pride about defeating Israel. How did Sadat sell the loss, turn over what the reality was to what there is a myth today?
Brilliant question. The answer is that the Israelis were very smart about it, and the Egyptians did reclaim their national honor. That was very, very, very important to them. 1967 humiliated a nation that is obsessed with not being humiliated. So the Egyptians did get to keep that little sliver of land east of the Suez Canal. Now, it's usually the winner that increases its territory, not the loser. Also, the Israelis made sure to put the force limitations, in other words, the idea that Egypt had to withdraw its army out of the battle zone, that was in a side letter. It's not in the actual separation agreement. So again, they did that to allow the Egyptians to keep their pride and say, oh, look, we won, we conquered this territory, now we have it, we now can reopen the Suez Canal, we achieved that, they could rebuild the cities along the Suez Canal, they could do all those things. But most people did not know that Israel had offered the Egyptians this before the war. Egypt could have achieved all of that without taking what we estimate to be about 18,000 killed, another 50,000 wounded. and a tremendous economic loss as well. So again, on the appearance, on the outside, it did look like a victory. And in an environment of controlled media, it wasn't that hard for them to claim victory. But the people in the know all knew what happened. And it's in all the memoirs.
Next question. We have more questions than usual.
Fabulous.
Yes. To what extent was Nixon calling the shots? Or was he mired down in Watergate at the time? Or was it really President Kissinger?
It was all President Kissinger. Nixon, October 1973, was, this is something I discuss in the book, was when Watergate metastasized. That is when the Nixon administration completely imploded. By coincidence, it's also the month in which Vice President Spiro Agnew had to resign as well. It was the month of the Saturday Night Massacre. Some of you might be old enough to remember that. That's when Nixon knew he was probably in the White House on borrowed time. He had something of a mental collapse. He was taking pills. He was drinking heavily. The night that the Americans decided to go to DEFCON 3, they deliberately held it in the White House. Nixon never showed up. He was, quote unquote, asleep upstairs. But there was an admiral there named Thomas Moorer, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In 2007, his diary was declassified, and he wrote in his diary that Nixon was drunk, and he wasn't there at all. And then after the crisis was over on October the 26th, he gave a press conference in which he said, people thought that the president couldn't function. Well, I showed him I could function. I am better when I'm under pressure. And the really scary part is that the same thing was happening in the Soviet Union, because Leonid Brezhnev at that time was addicted to pain pills, which when he drank them, when he had them with vodka, he also would completely black out. So he wasn't involved in the decision-making there either. We found this out in 2018. So you had two dysfunctional governments that fortunately did not blunder into World War III. Can I just make one last point? The responsible adult in the room in Moscow, paradoxically enough, was Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, who was thought of as this crazy radical figure. But when it counted most, he was the one who said, oh, no, we're not going to World War III over Egypt and Syria. So there you have it.
The next question is connected to what you just said. What is true about the threat of nuclear weapons? Whether Diane actually called for their being put together in the early days of the war when he thought all was lost, and even later on when the United States and the Soviet Union got involved.
So the Americans and the Soviets never even got close to a nuclear war. America went to DEFCON 3, but America was in DEFCON 3 on a permanent basis in Vietnam. So it wasn't like this was some brand new thing. It sounded ominous enough. The Soviets backed down immediately. So there was never any real risk of nuclear war that way. Now, with respect to Israel, it's a lot more complicated. On October the 9th, we now know, and it was only declassified a couple of years ago, that Dayan argued to ready the nuclear weapons, not fire them, but just prepare them. That was a process that took about a day. And he said, this way we'll at least save the day. Now, Golda had none of it. Once the nuclear weapons are ready, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, especially if the other side finds out, and then maybe the Soviets decide on a first strike. So she refused. However, Dado, David Elazar, the chief of staff of the Israeli army, told his American counterpart after the war that if the Syrians had penetrated into northern Israel, he had every intention of going nuclear. So it was a pretty dangerous situation. I'd say that's definitely as close as they've come.
Dado in the film, Golda, is played by one of Israel's leading actors, Lior Ashkenazi, who we've actually brought to Pleasant Hill years ago to honor him. I think these
Can I interrupt on that point? When they did the TV movie in Israel years ago, Moshe Dayan had a son who was an actor, Asi Dayan. So they put an eye patch on him, and he looked just like Moshe Dayan because it was his kid. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I want to thank you again, everyone. Our Jewish Book Council authors speak out of the generosity of their hearts. They are not paid an honorarium. To thank them, go on and purchase 18 Days in October. It is not just to thank him, but you will really appreciate reading the entire story It is an excellent book, gotten great reviews. Senator Joseph Lieberman writes, Kaufman tells the story brilliantly. Anyone interested in the Middle East will appreciate his work. I want to wish everyone Shana Tova, a sweet, happy, and book-filled New Year. Uri, Toda Rabah. Shana Tova to everyone. And we'll see you in another book talk after the holidays. Bye.
Shana Tova, and thank you all.